Hello and welcome back to Answering Bart Ehrman, and we're continuing our way through his book, Jesus Interrupted. And today, Matthew, I think that we are looking at one of the sections that Bart Ehrman is most famous for. I think out of all of his writings, this one is right up there. It's the one I see atheists refer to, the arguments I hear Muslims referring to. So today I think is going to be a very interesting time reading these sections of his book. So can you please read for us? We're on page 15 to 16, and we're going to read that paragraph. Can you please read it for us?
Yeah, no problem. So it's the second paragraph into the section, accepting the historical critical method. And Ehrman says, it is hard for me to pinpoint the exact moment that I stopped being a fundamentalist who believed in the absolute inerrancy and verbal inspiration of the Bible. As I point out in the book, Misquing Jesus, the key issue for me early on was the historical fact that we don't have the original writings of any of the books of the Bible, but only copies made later, in most instances, many centuries later. For me, it started making less and less sense to think that God had inspired the very words of the text if we didn't actually have these words, if the texts had in fact been changed in many thousands of places, most of the changes insignificant, but many of them of real importance. If God wanted us to have his words, why didn't he preserve his words? Yeah, some big claims there, Sam.
Yeah. And as I said, for me, this is what I hear people referring to Bart Ehrman to, very often saying, we don't have the originals, the Bible's been changed. And look, I thought he refers here to misquoting Jesus at the start of that paragraph. And he goes, he points out in misquoting Jesus. So I've got that here. So what I thought is we'll read what he typically says, and that's often quoted for him.
Sure. Yeah, and it's worth adding, so Bart Ehrman is actually a textual scholar, so this should be the thing he's an expert in, and we should expect him to be able to say measured and scholarly things about, namely the textual evidence for the New Testament in particular. That's something he should be very reliable on, should be our expectation going into it.
I think that's a really important point you just brought up, because he studied under Bruce Metzger.
Yeah.
And so he should be giving us sensible, careful statements.
Scholarly statements. That's it. Yeah.
All right. So this is from, as I said, this is from Misquoting Jesus. Let's have a look at it here.
Yeah.
So he's, first of all, he's talking about the abundance of evidence that we have for the New Testament, and we'll look at that a bit later on. And he's saying, we've got a lot of evidence for the New Testament. And he says, with this abundance of evidence, what can we say about the total number of variants known today? Scholars differ significantly in their estimates. Some say there are 200,000 variants known. Some say 300,000, some 400,000 or more. We do not know for such because despite impressive developments in computer technology, no one has been able to count them all. Perhaps, as I indicated earlier, it is best simply to leave the matter in comparative terms. There are more variations among the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. So now I just want to say, with that type of quote, what type of impression is he making there?
He wants to overwhelm you with how extraordinarily unreliable the New Testament is on the basis of the textual evidence is the impression he's giving. It's knowing a little bit about how you go about establishing a text. It's quite amusing. It's annoying, actually, the way he's presented it. But anyway, I'm sure we'll get to that. But yeah, he's certainly trying to overwhelm us with the idea that you just can't know what the Bible actually said originally.
Yeah. So if he's saying there's potentially 400,000 variants among the manuscripts, and he didn't mention this, but there's 138,020 words in the New Testament. then if there's 138,000 words and there's 400,000 variants, then the impression he's giving is that, we know nothing. We've got nothing left. There's more variants than words, and so we know nothing. That's the impression, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the impression. Now, I want to say that he's playing a trick on us here.
Yeah.
Let me go here. This is Bart Ehrman's trick, because he's treating all variants as if they're meaningful. Okay? With handwritten documents, there are just variants. But the overwhelming number of variants for the New Testament are meaningless.
Yeah.
So they may be how a word is spelt. There were different conventions as to whether or not for verbs you may have an epsilon, which is a Greek letter, at the end of the word, or you may not have that letter there. It makes absolutely no difference at all to the spelling. It's just different writing conventions. Now, that counts for thousands of these variants, and they're completely meaningless.
Yeah.
Right? The second one is word order. There are thousands of differences with the word order. But again, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't change the meaning, because the Greek language has what's called, it's declined. And so it's got certain endings on the end of words, which tells you how it functions in the sentence. And so you can put the words in different orders and it means exactly the same thing because of the way the words are written.
Yeah.
And so again, there is no translational difference. There's no difference in meaning, but it counts as a difference. And so he's putting these numbers up here, which do not change the meaning at all with the examples, that he's giving for these numbers. But he's creating an impression that it's really unreliable. I think the other thing also, sorry, you're going to say something?
I was going to say, you could turn his evidence on its head, and you should, actually. The fact that we have so many variations is because we have so much evidence, so many texts. If you have 1,000 copies of parts of the New Testament and each of them have a spelling mistake, then he's counting that as 1,000 errors in our New Testament, and we can't possibly know what it meant because we have all these errors. It's actually the opposite. We have so many copies of the New Testament that it's actually fairly easy to establish what the original was on the basis of that evidence. So he's flipped it on its head. It's a shocking sleight of hand, really.
Yeah, it is. And the last point I was going to bring up was that where there are copying errors, most of these can be identified, right? So you and I sometimes send text messages or Facebook Messenger messages to each other, and sometimes you might leave out a word, right? You might just skip a word, but when I read it, I automatically adjust for that. I know what you meant. I know what it was supposed to be, and it's the same with writing of the New Testament. If somebody skips a line, they go from one line and they skip down half a line early, you can identify that.
That's a classic example. That example.
Yeah. So the real question is, how many of these differences are significant? Just giving a number doesn't prove anything. In fact, I've got a book here which really has a go at Bart Ehrman and Christians as well. It's called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism.
Yeah.
And it just looks at all the ridiculous claims that people like Bart Ehrman and also some Christians make about the New Testament. And so if you want to make reasonable claims about the New Testament, I really recommend this book. I found it very helpful.
Yeah, great.
Now, the next thing I want to say about Bart Ehrman is that he's dishonest when he writes. So we just read before what he said in, what was it?
Misquoting
Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? So there's more variants than there are words in the New Testament, really creating an impression that, we can't know. And that's what he writes when he writes for the popular audience. For atheists, for Muslims, for people who want to, have a go at Christianity. But when he writes for the academic world, he writes very differently. And I want to give you two examples. So this is him, right? Bart Ehrman, in this book here, The Text of the New Testament in Contemporary Research. And this is what he writes here. Textual scholars have enjoyed reasonable success at establishing to the best of their abilities the original text of the New Testament. Now, that's a long way from what he was saying in Misquoting Jesus. He's saying here, no, that they've done it reasonably well. They've got reasonable success. Right?
And that's because he's writing for an audience who can fact check him because they know how these things are conducted and so on.
Yeah, because he's writing for academics. And if he wrote what he wrote in Misquoting Jesus for academics, they'd laugh him out of the academy and just say, you're ridiculous. I'll give you another example. This is the book he wrote with Bruce Metzger on the text of the New Testament.
Yep.
And he's been writing here about how we don't have many copies for many of the ancient classical books which are not Christian, like Plato and Aristotle and all that type of thing. We don't have many of their books from the ancient world. But he's saying for the New Testament, we've actually got a lot. And he says, in contrast with these low figures of other books, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material.
Yeah.
So he's saying something very different here. We've got way more material than for any other ancient book. Furthermore, the work of many ancient authors has been preserved only in manuscripts that date from the Middle Ages, sometimes the late Middle Ages, far removed from the time at which they lived and wrote. On the contrary, the time between the composition of the books of the New Testament and the earliest extant copies is relatively brief. Instead of a lapse of a millennia or more, as is the case with not a few classical authors, several papyrus manuscripts of portions of the New Testament are extant that were copied within a century or so after the composition of the original documents. So again, this is Bart Ehrman writing for the academic world. And what's he saying? We've got more evidence for the New Testament than for these other books. And it takes us right up to within a century after they were written. So I just hope people can see that he writes very differently depending upon what audience he's writing to. And so there's a degree of dishonesty there. This is, books like Misquoting Jesus. Let me change this here. Books like Misquoting Jesus are sensationalism.
Yeah.
That's it. It's sensationalism. And it's just simply, trying to sell books through being sensationalist and making sensationalist statements.
Yeah.
But I want to now just talk about what do we know about the New Testament? What evidence do we have? And so I want to quickly look at some of this now. There are three main evidences we have. And again, Bart Ehrman brings these up in his book with Bruce Metzger on the text of the New Testament. We have ancient copies in the original language, and these go back to the to the 2nd century. So we've got ancient copies, we've got ancient translations, and ancient quotes. And so the ancient copies in the original language, show us the copies that were made, and we can look at those. We've also got ancient translations. Now, a translation doesn't give you the exact wording, but it still gives you an overall impression of what the original language was. You can tell how many chapters there were, what the flow of the story was. It's still an important witness. And we've got very early translations there. And then we've also got ancient quotes. And that is, from the time of the Apostolic Fathers, who are the writers after the New Testament writers, we see them starting to quote the New Testament. And so, if you write, you write a birthday card for someone and you write a Bible verse in it, that birthday card now becomes evidence of what the Bible is that you had.
Yeah,
right?
it's really significant actually, because if you read some of that material, you'll find they quote things at length. It's been said if you read the church fathers, people writing kind of the first 2 or 3 centuries, we'll say, of Christianity, most of the Bible's quoted multiple
Yeah, a
times,
lot of it is.
and
A lot of
and
it's
um,
quoted.
and and there are, in fact, there's actually early histories that are quoted at length in other books in this period. That's the only witness we have to those. So they're preserving other historical material as well. Which, yeah,
Yeah.
just to say, it is actually a very important witness to what the Bible actually said and what people knew it said in the first couple of centuries.
Yeah, so that's the evidence we have,
Yeah.
and basically what scholars do is they can now get all this evidence out there, and they just go through it line by line, word by word. And what happens is, because these manuscripts will come from particular regions which are independent of other regions,
Hmm.
it means any change that is made in one region, will have no or minimal effect on copies being made in another region. And so by comparing the regions, you can deduct and establish and confirm what the original reading was. And so that's what scholars do. And so what I want to do now is I want to show our viewers the types of books that scholars write when they compare all the different ancient copies, translations, and quotes. And so what have we got here? We've got, you and I have both got one of these books. We got at college.
Yeah.
And
Critical edition of the New Testament. Yep.
And this is called a critical edition of the New Testament. And what it does is it gives you the Greek text. You can see up there, in arche, en hologos. So in the beginning was the word. And then down the bottom, it gives you the evidence from the ancient manuscripts so I'll go over to here. It gives you the evidence for the text above and where that evidence comes from. So, we're very open about it. You can get these books and you can have a look at them. So when we look at these books, how does it compare to what Bart Ehrman was saying? Bart was saying, 400,000 variants, more variants than the number of words in the New Testament. Well, what type of meaningful variants do the scholars actually say? And so what we're going to do here is go over to here. So at the introduction to this book, it says this. It actually tells us how many meaningful variants there are. The evaluation of all 1,438 sets of variants cited in the apparatus have been completely reconsidered. So when you actually get the academics in this area who are not trying to be sensationalist, they say there's 1,438 sets of variants which need to be considered. These are not mistakes that can be easily, can just be spotted, for skipping a line. They're not just spelling a word differently because of convention or word order. It's not that type of thing. But these are the variants where we go, no, you know what? We're not 100% sure on this, and we've got to consider it. We need to judge these variants. So 1,438. Now, that might sound like a lot to people. First of all, it's a lot less than 400,000. Right? Yeah. So we've come down to a lot less than what Bart was suggesting. And to put it in perspective, sometimes these variants might be a single letter within a word, which may change the meaning of the verb.
Yep.
Sometimes it might be a phrase. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to treat these variants as a whole word. And that's sort of about halfway between, a single letter and a phrase. So how significant are 1,438 variants? Well, what have we got here? There's 138,020 words in the New Testament. So that works out at 1.04%.
So there's questions about words or grammar or spelling or whatever in about 1.04% of the New Testament.
Yes. Now, I want to say that is remarkable for a handwritten document 2,000 years old.
It is, yeah.
That is excellent preservation.
Mm.
That is excellent preservation. And so we can be confident of 99%. And then there's the 1%, and you'll actually see that it's listed in the footnotes. There's about 1% where we're saying, you know, we need to judge this and think about it a bit more.
Yeah, and this is an area which serious Christians are conversant with, they're aware of, and that they engage with. And you quickly find you actually do it, that it doesn't actually cause you problems. This isn't a thing that you read in your Bible and you go, oh, I wonder what this doctrine is. There's actually no theological questions at stake here, no belief questions. The message of the New Testament is actually, it's entirely there, entirely consistent, regardless of these questions. It's minutiae, really, most of the kinds of things we're talking about, which is not to say it's not important, but to keep perspective, we're not talking about some Christian doctrine being different on the basis of these things.
Yeah. So when we don't listen to sensationalists like Bart Ehrman, we actually come away with a value of about 99%, which is excellent. Now, I just wanted to finish up by looking at the atheist. You might be an atheist watching this. And to the atheist, I want to say we have more evidence for the New Testament than for anything from classical from classical philosophy. So you might be saying, oh, I'm an atheist, but, you know, I want to engage with the classical world, with Plato and Aristotle. We don't have anywhere near as much evidence for them as we do for the Bible.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be critical of the Bible, you need to realize that you've got no ground compared to the Bible.
Yeah, and some of those texts are an absolute mess compared to,
But at university, they'll just be quoted and people will refer to them and they don't raise any questions. And you know what? You don't need to because they have been well preserved. I'm actually not being critical of those books. I'm all for reading them, actually. So I'm not being critical of them. What I'm critical of is atheists who want to have a go at the New Testament when many of the books they would refer to in their studies have a lot less evidence. And it's just that hypocrisy that I want to point out to the atheists there.
Yeah.
But I've also got a message for the Muslim, because the Muslim, I've met many Muslims who love Bart Ehrman, and they, they're always quoting these books to me, right? I want to say, you've got your own questions too when it comes to the Quran. Muhammad never made an autograph of the Quran. It was his companions who did it, and they made different collections. One of these collections was made the standard collection. The rest were destroyed. And even that single collection today has developed into multiple Qurans. So I've got 3 different Arabic Qurans, not translations. Right? So Muslims have got their own questions. And in fact, when it comes to variants, I thought I may as well dig these out. It took me a long time to get them. So you can see here, this is a 6-volume set with over 10,000 variants for the Quran.
Yeah.
Right. And so, again, Islamic academics have this, right? And again, I'm not really wanting to have a go at the Quran at this point, because I'm saying we both have these textual type of questions that we need to address, and we can address, and our academics have addressed, and we need to be sensible and not sensationalist about it. But what I am saying is, when Muslims say one perfect Quran, no variations, look, Bart Ehrman says the Bible's corrupted, I'm saying that's just nonsense.
Yeah.
You've got thousands of variants in the Quran. Stop exaggerating.
And realize it's a book that's 600 years newer and doesn't have nearly the textual evidence to establish the original text that the New Testament does.
That's right.
It's a much more difficult thing to evaluate on the basis of actual evidence, unfortunately.
So look, I think that'll do us for today. Come and join us next week, where we'll be looking at Bart as he begins to talk about authorship and other issues. And so we shall see you then.
Thanks.